I've always prided myself on being independent. Growing up, my parents taught me the importance of standing on my own 2 feet. I was determined to build a life where I didn't rely on anyone else. After graduating from college, I moved into my own apartment. It wasn't the biggest or the most luxurious place, but it was mine, and that's all that mattered. I worked hard at a local cafe, juggling shifts, and doing everything I could to make ends meet. Some days were better than others, but I had my routine, and that gave me a sense of control. Life hadn't always been easy. There were times when I struggled to pay bills, and I learned quickly that being independent wasn't always as glamorous as it sounded. There were months where I had to choose between eating a full meal or paying rent. There were sleepless nights where I wondered if I was making the right choices, but I never gave up. I made it work. The thought of being able to call something my own, my home, kept me going. But everything changed the day I met Mr. Johnson, my 40-year-old landlord. He wasn't like the other landlords I had heard about, distant and uninvolved. He owned the building where I rented, a small but cozy apartment complex tucked in a quiet corner of the city. He was in his early 40s, and every time we crossed paths in the hallway, he seemed like he had it all together. Always dressed in neat, well-fitting clothes, with a calm demeanor that made him seem like someone you could trust. But there was something about him that made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. At first, everything seemed normal. He greeted me politely when we bumped into each other, asking about how I was settling in, if I needed anything. I always thought it was nice that he cared enough to ask. After all, landlords were supposed to check in on their tenants, right? But slowly, as time passed, his friendliness started to feel a little too personal. He seemed to show up more often, always at the most random times, always asking about my day, how I was managing with the rent. It started to feel less like casual conversation and more like something else entirely. I didn't think much of it at first, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. After all, he was just the landlord. But as weeks turned into months, and I continued to balance my job and expenses, I began to realize that maybe things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. Mr. Johnson's behavior became harder to ignore, and I started to question whether my independence was really enough to keep me safe from people like him. I had recently gone through a rough patch financially, and it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. No matter how much I worked, it never seemed to be enough. My job at the local cafe, though steady, didn't pay nearly as much as I needed. The tips were inconsistent, and my paycheck barely covered the essentials. I had always been able to stretch my budget, but this time, things were different. The bills piled up faster than I could pay them, and I found myself falling behind on rent for the first time in years. At first, I told myself it would be temporary, that I could catch up soon enough. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I had only half of what I owed, and I knew I couldn't afford to pay the rest. The thought of having to explain myself to Mr. Johnson, my landlord, made my stomach churn. I had always prided myself on being independent, on taking care of things without asking for help. But now, I was facing the possibility of losing the one thing I had worked so hard for, the roof over my head. My apartment had become more than just a place to live. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of the world outside. It was the one place where I could breathe freely, where I didn't have to worry about the judgment of others. Losing it felt like losing a part of myself. I couldn't imagine having to pack up and leave, with nowhere else to go. I had worked so hard to get here, and the idea of starting over, of finding another place, filled me with dread. I tried everything I could think of to make up the difference. I picked up extra shifts at the cafe, staying late and working weekends, but it never seemed to be enough. I even considered borrowing money from friends, but the thought of asking for help made me feel even more helpless. How could I explain to anyone that I had gotten myself into this situation? I couldn't let anyone know how close I was to losing everything. I remember one night, sitting on my bed, staring at the rent bill that I couldn't pay. The numbers on the paper seemed to mock me, reminding me of how far behind I had fallen. I was terrified of what would happen next. Would Mr. Johnson evict me? Would I be forced to leave my home and face the harsh reality of not knowing where I'd go? The thought alone made my heart race, but I knew I couldn't ignore it for much longer. The fear of losing my apartment was consuming me, and the weight of it was unbearable. It was the only place I had to call my own, and I would do anything to keep it. Anything. One evening, I mustered all the courage I had left to go and deliver the rent, hoping Mr. Johnson wouldn't notice how anxious I was. I had only managed to scrape together half of the amount I owed. As I made my way up the stairs to his office, my heart pounded with every step. My palms were sweaty, and I couldn't shake the tight knot in my stomach. This moment felt so much heavier than any I had faced before. When I knocked on his door and entered, Mr. Johnson looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. There was a certain stillness in the room that made me feel as though I was walking into a trap. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, but it wasn't with the usual warmth I had come to expect. Instead, it was as though he was carefully assessing me, sizing me up in a way that made my discomfort grow. "I'm afraid I can't accept only half of the rent, Sarah," he said, his voice unusually calm, almost too calm. The words hit me like a slap, and I instantly felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I had known this moment would come, but hearing him say it out loud made the reality of my situation even more terrifying. He didn't raise his voice or sound angry, which was somehow worse. His tone was controlled, almost too smooth. "You'll need to find a way to make up the rest, or there will be consequences," he added, the finality of his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. My mind raced, trying to come up with a way out of this, a way to make him understand the mess I was in. But nothing came to mind. All I could focus on was the weight of what he'd said and the coolness in his eyes. I had always known Mr. Johnson to be a reasonable person, someone who kept his distance and followed the rules, but now, standing before me, he felt different. His calm demeanor was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, something I didn't want to discover. I tried to speak, to explain myself, but my voice faltered. I'm doing everything I can," I said, the words barely audible. My throat felt dry, and I was afraid I might start to cry. The last thing I wanted was to appear weak, but how could I hide it? I had never been in a situation like this before, and the fear of losing my apartment was starting to drown me. Mr. Johnson didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at me, his fingers lightly tapping on the desk. I could feel the tension growing thicker between us, like an invisible force pressing down on my chest. It was as though the air had become too heavy to breathe. His silence made me more anxious than any harsh words could. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice softer now, but still carrying an undertone that sent a chill through me. "You know, Sarah, everyone has their limits," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And I'm afraid you're testing mine." The words lingered in the room, and for a split second, I wondered if I could make it out of there without breaking down. But all I could do was nod and clutch the envelope with the half payment tighter, knowing that the consequences he mentioned would soon become my reality. I panicked, the reality of the situation hitting me harder than I could have ever imagined. My body froze, and for a moment, I couldn't think straight. I didn't want to move out. I couldn't. My apartment was the only thing I had left that felt like mine. It wasn't just a place to stay, it was my sanctuary, the only piece of stability I had in a life that often felt uncertain. But now, with Mr. Johnson's calm but firm words hanging in the air, I felt trapped. How could I come up with the rest of the money? I had already stretched every dollar I had, and there was no one I could turn to. The rent was due, and I couldn't afford it. My stomach twisted with anxiety as I tried to think of any possible way out of this mess. Nothing came to mind. I was too deep into my struggle, and I couldn't see a clear way out. I took a deep breath, my voice shaky as I finally spoke. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know what to do. I've been trying to make ends meet, working extra shifts at the cafe, but it's not enough. I've never been in this position before, and I'm scared. I can't lose this place. It's all I have." My words spilled out in a jumble, and as soon as they left my mouth, I felt exposed. I hated asking for help. I hated admitting how desperate I was, but I didn't know what else to do. Mr. Johnson just stared at me, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, his gaze softening slightly as if he were considering something, weighing his options. I felt small under his gaze, like he was looking into me, past the surface, seeing all my insecurities and struggles. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost too calm. "There's a way to settle the debt, Sarah," he said, his words carrying a weight that made my heart skip a beat. "But it's not what you might expect." His cryptic words hung in the air, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What did he mean? A way to settle the debt? I searched his face for any hint of what he was really saying, but it was like staring into a mask. He was giving me nothing, just a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, to clarify what he was suggesting, but I couldn't seem to form the words. There was a sinking feeling in my chest, as if I were standing on the edge of something I couldn't see but somehow already knew. Was he offering a solution? Or was he about to make things far worse than they already were? His tone, too smooth, too calm, made me uneasy, and I knew whatever he was about to say wouldn't be something I could easily walk away from. I stood there, my mind racing, my heart thudding loudly in my ears. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the uncertainty of what was coming next. I had no choice but to wait, to listen, but I had the sickening feeling that I was already in deeper than I could handle. The next day, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I had to talk to someone who cared about me. I took a deep breath and called Alex, my boyfriend. We'd been together for a little over a year, and though he was always there for me, I felt conflicted about telling him just how bad things had gotten. He was my support, my rock, and I didn't want to drag him into the mess I had made of my life. When we met later that afternoon, I tried to remain calm. I didn't want him to see how much I was struggling, how much the weight of my situation was tearing me apart. But as soon as I began to explain, I could hear the unease in my voice, the way it trembled as I told him about the rent and how I had fallen behind. Alex listened quietly, his brow furrowed in concern as I spoke. His patience never wavered, and I could feel his eyes on me, trying to understand what I was saying, even when my words seemed to get lost in the chaos of my mind. "It's okay, Sarah," he said softly, taking my hand in his. "We'll figure this out together. We always do." But even as his words were meant to reassure me, I couldn't help but feel the weight of shame creeping up inside me. I didn't want him to know just how far I had fallen behind. I didn't want him to know that I was so financially unstable, so overwhelmed by life. I didn't want him to see me like this, as though I was incapable of handling my own problems. I had always prided myself on being independent, on not relying on others for help. I had worked hard to get where I was, and now it felt like everything was unraveling. The guilt of having to admit I couldn't make ends meet felt suffocating. I could see in Alex's eyes that he wanted to help, that he wanted to fix it, but deep down, I knew I was carrying a burden I didn't want to share. I didn't want to drag him into the mess I had created. "I'm sorry," I whispered, looking down at our hands. "I shouldn't have let things get this bad. I should have done better." Alex squeezed my hand gently, a reassuring smile on his face. "You don't have to apologize, Sarah. You're not in this alone. We'll work through it, together." But even as he said that, I could feel a knot in my stomach tighten. I didn't want to burden him with my financial mess, with all the things that had gone wrong in my life. He didn't deserve that. I wanted to be the one who could take care of everything, to solve my own problems without asking anyone for help. I had always been the strong one, the responsible one. And now, I felt like I was failing. The conversation with Alex was both a comfort and a reminder of how much I was holding back, how much I was keeping hidden. As much as I wanted his support, I couldn't help but feel embarrassed, ashamed even, that I had let things get so out of control. How had I let myself get to this point? How had I failed so badly at something so basic as managing my own finances? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was disappointing him, that he might look at me differently after hearing the truth. As we sat there, holding hands in silence, I wondered if he really understood how much I was struggling, or if he would soon start seeing me as someone incapable of taking care of her own life. The thought of him looking at me like that made my heart ache, but I pushed the thought away. I couldn't let him see me like that, not yet. Not until I had figured it out, and not until I could stand on my own again. A few days later, I received a message from Mr. Johnson asking me to come to his office. My stomach tightened as I read the text. I had been trying to put the rent situation out of my mind, but the truth was that it was still hanging over me like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. I didn't want to face him, but I had no choice. If I wanted to keep my apartment, I had to find a way to make things right. When I walked into his office, the atmosphere felt different. Mr. Johnson's usual stern demeanor was replaced by something warmer, more welcoming, almost too friendly. There was a soft smile on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something about it made me uneasy. I had never seen him like this before. He gestured for me to sit, his eyes studying me carefully as I took a seat across from him. "Sarah, I know you've been going through a tough time," he began, his voice smooth and almost too calm. "I wanted to talk to you about your rent payment. I understand things aren't always as simple as they seem, and sometimes, life throws curveballs." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. His words were laced with a certain politeness, but beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of something else. Something I couldn't quite place. It felt like he was trying too hard to make me feel at ease, but instead, I just felt more tense, more aware of the unease building inside me. "I'm not going to make things difficult for you, Sarah," Mr. Johnson continued. "I'm sure we can come to an understanding. You don't have to worry about paying the full rent upfront if it's too much for you to handle. There are other ways to settle this." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, my mind went blank. Other ways to settle the rent? What was he suggesting? My gut told me something was off, but I couldn't afford to be picky. I needed this apartment. I couldn't risk losing it. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of his offer. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering in tone. "I can help you out, Sarah. I'll make things easier for you, but there's a catch. It's a simple arrangement. I'm sure we can work something out." The way he said simple arrangement made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, but something about his tone, the way he was watching me, made me feel uncomfortable. His eyes held a glint that I couldn't ignore, but I was too focused on my situation to push it aside. I had no choice. "I understand this might seem unusual," he added, his smile widening just a little. "But think of it as a way to get this situation sorted without any more stress." I wanted to say no, to leave and tell him I would find another way, but the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't lose my home. I didn't have the luxury of walking away. My hands clenched tightly in my lap, my fingers digging into the fabric of my jeans as I fought back the overwhelming feeling of dread that was starting to rise in me. "I'll agree," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words leaving my mouth almost against my will. I didn't want to accept his offer, but what choice did I have? I had no other way to pay, and no one else to turn to. The next day, my landlord booked a hotel room for us. He invited me inside with a smile, but as I stepped into the room, I could feel the tension in the air. His eyes were different, filled with something I couldn't quite understand. I tried to shake off the strange feeling swirling in my chest, but it wouldn't go away. I cautiously sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the soft sheets beneath me. The room felt oddly still, as if the air itself was waiting for something. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening, but I couldn't make sense of it. I glanced around the room, hoping to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. He was standing by the door, watching me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. His usual friendly demeanor was replaced with something darker, something that made my stomach tighten. Slowly, he took a few steps forward, his eyes never leaving me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, like it was pressing on my skin, making me uncomfortable. There was something different about the way he was looking at me, as if he was studying me, searching for something in my expression. I wanted to move, to get up and leave, but I stayed frozen, unsure of how to act. I didn't want to offend him, not after everything he had done for me. But the air in the room was thick, and every moment that passed made my discomfort grow. His smile, once warm and reassuring, now seemed forced, almost as if he were trying to hide something behind it. He stepped closer, and I instinctively shifted back on the bed. My heart began to race, but I tried to keep my composure, hoping that my nerves weren't showing. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, though there was an edge to it that made my skin prickle. I nodded, though the words stuck in my throat. My mind screamed for me to say something, to break the silence, but nothing seemed right. All I could do was sit there, feeling the space between us shrinking, the tension rising. I didn't know what to do, or what he wanted, but something inside me told me that this moment was going to change everything. Before I knew it, everything around us seemed to blur, and the room grew warmer, heavier with each passing second. I wasn't sure how it had happened or when things had shifted, but the space between us had closed entirely. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and in that slow, breathless moment, nothing seemed to matter except the electricity in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my thoughts were scattered, unable to keep up with what was unfolding. One moment, we were standing just a few feet apart, and the next, his hands were on me, tentative at first, but then with more certainty. I felt my breath catch in my throat as his touch sent shivers through my body, and before I could fully comprehend what was happening, the barrier of clothing between us was gone. I stood there, exposed, unsure of what had come over me, but unable to stop the course of events that had already begun. Everything felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. I looked at him, and for a brief moment, our eyes met, his gaze filled with an intensity that took my breath away. The world around me seemed to fade, and the only thing that remained was the undeniable pull between us, growing stronger with each passing second. I should have said something, should have stopped it before it went too far, but the words never came. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, too confused and too lost in the moment to think clearly. All I could focus on was the rising heat, the closeness, and the undeniable feeling of vulnerability that came with being so exposed, so bare. The silence was deafening, and the weight of the situation pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. But later he told me that for this month, I wouldn't need to worry about paying a single penny. My rent was completely covered, and I didn't have to do anything in return. I thanked him, not sure how to respond to such an unexpected act of generosity. He smiled and waved it off, saying it was no big deal, but it felt like a huge deal to me. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the kindness, the trust, and the unspoken understanding between us. In that moment, I wasn't just a tenant to him, I was someone he had chosen to help, and that thought lingered in my mind long after he had left. But as time went on, the generosity started to feel like more than just a favor. There was something deeper beneath the surface that I couldn't quite grasp. I couldn't help but wonder why he had chosen to do this, what his true intentions were. The rent might have been free, but the price I was paying in my mind was much higher, filled with uncertainty and questions that I didn't have answers to.